We're looking at some versions of the Connections cowl, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of color dominance and stranded knitting. When you strand two yarns behind the work in knitting, the way the yarns are stranded determines which color on the front of the work will be prominent and which color will recede. And I've illustrated that in this pattern here, of the worsted weight, by changing the stranding for this section. And you can see, I think, in this bottom section and then these above, that these white stitches going up are prominent and the black stitches recede into the background. Whereas in this line of the pattern, it's the black stitches that are more prominent going up with the white ones receding into the background. When you knit with stranded knitting with a yarn in each hand, which is how I do it, it's always the left hand, the yarn carried in the left hand that strands under the other yarn. It just does that naturally. And it's the yarn that strands under that becomes dominant on the front of the knitting. And the yarn that's carried in the right hand strands above and is the receding or the background yarn on the front of the knitting. And you can see that when you look at on the front. You can also see it when you look on the back of the knitting. You can see that the black yarn is prominent in the areas where I was stranding with the white yarn in my left hand, and the white yarn is prominent on the back when I was stranding with the black yarn in my left hand. You can also pay attention to the way that you manipulate the yarn if you carry the yarn, both yarns in the same hand. You don't have to use two different hands, and just manipulate it if you're carrying with your right hand both yarns, so that the one that you strand under is the one that will become dominant on the front of the work. Now, in this pattern where we have pretty much equal usage of both yarns, and the pattern itself is the result of kind of offsetting these very simple motifs, it's really important that whatever choice you've made in terms of which yarn will be dominant and which will be the background yarn, that you just be consistent in that usage. In these two cowls, I use the same yarns, and in this one, I stranded with the brown yarn in my left hand, which naturally makes it strand below and thus makes it dominant on the front. And in this one, I stranded with the green yarn in my left hand, making it dominant. You can see, I think, that it's a very subtle difference. Overall, the two cowls are very similar, and I think they're equally pleasing, but I was consistent in how I stranded, and I think that you can see that if you were inconsistent and kind of randomly changed hands, it would result in a much less pleasing motif in these. In the areas where purl stitches are involved, it won't matter how the yarn is carried, because the yarns aren't both being stranded along the back of the work. One yarn is stranding in front, purling, and the other yarn is stranded in the back. So it's always the yarn in front that's doing the purling that's prominent in that. In other Fair Isle patterns or other stranded colorwork patterns, sometimes the colors are changed much more frequently, and you're not just using two colors. And it might notice if you aren't consistent with how the yarn is stranded in those patterns, but it may be a little bit less noticeable than it would be in a pattern like this, where there are only two colors, and I think it would notice very strongly and take away from the look of the pattern. So that's the dominant color you'll want to decide for this pattern, and always strand it below and be consistent with how the yarns are carried throughout the pattern.